I told him I wasn't happy, he said, then don't be with me. I don't even remember why I said it out loud. Maybe I wanted him to see the tension in me, the restless knot in my chest that had nothing to do with him, but everything to do with how messy life felt lately. We were standing in the corner of a tiny, dimly lit bookstore tucked between a row of shuttered cafes. The smell of old paper and faint coffee lingered, soft and grounding. It was the kind of place where people whispered even when they weren't supposed to. She was leaning against the counter, arms crossed, her posture both commanding and relaxed at the same time, the way someone does when they know exactly who they are and don't feel the need to prove it. Her dark hair was streaked with early silver at the temples, and her eyes, those sharp, assessing eyes, kept flicking over me in a way that made my skin feel too aware of itself. She had a presence that didn't just fill the room, it rearranged it. I shuffled my feet, suddenly conscious of the way my sneakers scuffed against the worn wooden floor. I don't know, I said, my voice catching somewhere between confession and excuse. She didn't move right away. Just tilted her head slightly, like she was listening not to the words, but to the space between them. There was a pause, long enough that I started to wonder if I'd said the wrong thing, or too much, or maybe both. Then she picked up a book from the counter, letting it slide slowly through her fingers before flipping it around to show me the cover. You might like this, she said, her voice calm but carrying a weight I couldn't place. A subtle kindness, a gesture so small it might have been nothing, except for the fact that my stomach tightened like I'd just been caught off guard by sunlight in a dark room. I nodded, tried to smile. My fingers brushed hers as I took the book, and I felt it, the faint jolt of awareness that something unspoken had passed between us. Something that wasn't friendship, at least not entirely, and not yet anything I could name. Her laugh came next, soft but full-bodied, and it struck me because it didn't feel performative. It felt like her laughter, completely her own, carrying a hint of irony I couldn't read and wouldn't dare try. I caught myself staring for a moment too long, and I knew she noticed, because her eyes held mine just a fraction longer than necessary before she looked away. I wanted to ask her what she was thinking. I wanted to ask her if she noticed the way the air between us had changed, if she felt it too, the subtle, almost criminal spark of curiosity that seemed to hover like dust motes in the afternoon sun. But I didn't. Instead, I cleared my throat and tried to sound casual, though my voice betrayed me. She gave a half smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes, and turned back to the shelves. I could feel my pulse hammering, and I knew I'd be replaying that half smile, that brush of fingers, for hours. Maybe days. And I did. By the time I left, the street outside had emptied, and the lights of the bookstore spilled amber onto the pavement. I kept thinking about the way she'd stood there, leaning against the counter, every line of her body poised yet relaxed, and I realized I hadn't wanted to leave, not just the store, but the feeling of being near her. I told him I wasn't happy. He said, then don't be with me. And somehow, I thought about her instead. I hadn't planned to see her again so soon, but there she was, crouched behind the counter of the bookstore, trying to untangle a knot of cords from some old lamp display. I paused at the doorway, pretending to browse, though my eyes kept flicking to her. She didn't look up at first. Her hands moved deftly, the tendons standing out sharply, revealing more than she intended about how tense she was. I stepped closer, clearing my throat, and she glanced at me briefly, just a flicker, and then returned to her work. Need a hand? I asked, trying to keep my tone light, though my chest had started its familiar stutter. She hesitated. I caught that hesitation, the split-second twitch of her lips that suggested both gratitude and resistance. Finally, she nodded, muttering, "Be careful, it's older than me, and I swear it's plotting against us." As we worked together, I noticed everything, the soft calluses on her palms, the subtle way she tugged at her sleeves when she was anxious, the quiet sigh that slipped past her lips when one chord refused to cooperate. There was a vulnerability there she tried to hide, wrapped carefully in layers of control, but I saw it anyway. She laughed at one point, lightly, when I accidentally dropped a screwdriver. The sound was effortless yet held something deeper, like a shield she used to keep the rest of the world at bay. I watched the line of her jaw tighten when she frowned, the crease at the corner of her eyes when she squinted in concentration. Every small motion felt significant, magnetic even, though she moved as if she didn't care whether I noticed. I kept my distance, not wanting to overstep, but the pull was impossible to ignore. I wanted to reach out, to steady her hand when the cords twisted too tightly, but I held myself back, letting the space between us hum with quiet tension. "You're good at this," I said finally, my voice softer than intended. She glanced up, and for a moment, her gaze caught mine. There was something fleeting there, maybe surprise, maybe hesitation, but it made my chest tighten. Her lips pressed together as she looked away, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I've had practice," she replied, but the edge in her voice softened just enough to suggest she wasn't entirely guarding herself. We finished untangling the cords, and I stepped back, thinking the moment was over. But she didn't move away immediately. Instead, she leaned lightly against the counter, her shoulder brushing mine, the contact brief yet electric. I could feel the warmth of her, the subtle tremor in her fingers, and the faint scent of her perfume, something woodsy and warm, lingering in the space between us. Neither of us spoke, and for a heartbeat, the world outside the bookstore didn't exist. Then she smiled, a tiny, almost guilty smile, and turned back to her work, leaving me with that quiet, charged moment humming in the air. I stepped back to the shelves, pretending to be absorbed in a book, but my eyes kept drifting to her, watching her hands move, memorizing the curve of her shoulder, the subtle rhythm of her breath. And I knew, even as I tried to focus elsewhere, that the memory of that brush of contact would linger far longer than it should. It was late, later than either of us usually stayed, and the fluorescent lights of the small bookstore flickered against the rain-streaked windows. I was shelving new arrivals while she sat cross-legged on the floor, cataloging returns. The storm outside made the air feel thick, almost tangible, like it could hold the tension between us. She shifted closer, reaching for a pile of books, and our knees brushed for a moment. I froze, just slightly, hard hammering, and she didn't pull back immediately. Instead, she looked up at me, her eyes soft but guarded, like she'd noticed something she wasn't supposed to. "Do you ever think," she started, voice low, hesitant, "that some things should just stay in the dark?" I blinked, unsure if I'd heard her correctly. The words lingered, heavy with unspoken meaning. I opened my mouth to respond, but a phone rang, her ex, I guessed, from the contact name flashing on her screen. Her hand shook just slightly as she silenced it, and I noticed how the smallest gesture made her look almost fragile. "It's nothing," she said quickly, almost too quickly, brushing it off. But her voice had a tremor I couldn't ignore. I wanted to ask her what it was, wanted to tell her it was okay to let me in, but the line between curiosity and intrusion felt too sharp. We moved through the stacks, and each time our shoulders brushed, my mind raced. I caught myself imagining what it would be like to bridge that gap, to lean just a little closer, to let a word or a touch slip through. But I stayed still, careful, because something about her felt sacred, or maybe just untouchable. At one point, she bent down to retrieve a book under the lowest shelf, and the angle brought her closer to me than ever before. I could see the faint crease at the corner of her eyes when she frowned, the subtle curve of her neck, and the way her hair fell forward, almost masking her face. I wanted to reach out, to tuck the strand behind her ear, maybe, but I didn't. My hands stayed at my sides, trembling slightly anyway. She glanced up, catching my gaze. For a heartbeat, we just held it, neither speaking, the storm outside echoing the silence between us. I wanted to ask if she felt it too, the pull, the almost dangerous closeness, but I didn't. Then the front door swung open, a friend she hadn't expected stepping in to pick her up. She froze, instinctively pulling back, brushing at her sleeves, muttering a quick excuse. The moment snapped, leaving a hollow ache where the tension had been, a space I suddenly wanted to fill but couldn't. I watched her leave, umbrella clutched tightly in her hand, the rain dripping off the edges. And I stood there, heart still hammering, replaying the brush of knees, the tilt of her head, the almost confession that had hovered between us. I hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't acted, but I knew, somewhere deep down, that if the storm had lasted another 5 minutes, if no one had interrupted, something might have. And I couldn't stop thinking about it. We were closing up the bookstore together again, the last rays of sun cutting slivers of gold through the dusty windows. I stacked the remaining returns while she wiped down the counter, her movements deliberate, slow, like she was trying to stretch the minutes out. I wanted to break the silence, to say something, anything, but my voice felt foreign, heavy with a tension I couldn't untangle. Finally, she sighed, sharp enough to make me pause. "Do you ever wonder what we're doing?" she asked, not looking at me. Her words were careful, but the weight behind them made my chest tighten. I froze mid-step, fumbling with a stack of books. What do you mean?" I asked, though the question sounded hollow even to my own ears. She looked up then, finally, and for a long moment, she just held my gaze. Her eyes were steady, almost defiant, but there was a tremor there, small, almost invisible, but unmistakable. "I mean, us. This tension. The way we linger," she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "It's not nothing anymore. I don't know if it's supposed to be, but it isn't nothing. Do you?" I wanted to say yes. I wanted to confess that I replayed every brush of her hand, every accidental touch, every word unsaid. But instead, I swallowed and nodded, the words sticking like glue in my throat. She leaned back against the counter, arms folded, but the strength in her posture only made her vulnerability sharper. The silence stretched, filled with the hum of the old fluorescent lights and the distant sound of traffic outside. "I can't pretend this is normal anymore," she murmured. Her voice dropped, almost to herself, but I caught every word. "And maybe you don't have to." "But she stopped, lips pressing together, and I could see the struggle in her eyes. Something in her was holding back, but it was fraying at the edges. I stepped closer, careful not to close the space too quickly. The air between us was heavy, charged, and yet fragile. I could feel the faint warmth radiating from her, subtle, human, impossible to ignore. "Maybe we should," I started, but I didn't know what I meant. "Maybe talk, maybe step back, maybe just to breathe." She shook her head slightly, a wry, sad smile ghosting her lips. "No. I think maybe we need to say what's really happening, even if it scares us. Even if it ruins whatever we thought this was." We both stayed still, eyes locked. Her breath hitched just a little, and for the first time, I noticed how tired she looked, lines I'd never paid attention to, the faint slump in her shoulders when she thought no one was watching. And then, almost in a whisper, almost to herself, she said something that made my chest tighten. "I don't know if I can do this, and yet, I don't know how to stop." The words lingered in the air, a fragile, devastating confession that left me rooted, helpless, and more aware of her than ever. I wanted to reach out, but I didn't. All I could do was watch, feeling the quiet pull between us, knowing nothing would ever feel normal again. I found her sitting on the floor behind the counter again, knees pulled to her chest, a stack of old letters spread out in front of her. The store was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes every sound sharper. "You came back," she said softly, not looking up. Her voice carried a weight I hadn't heard before, something older, raw. Yeah," I said, crouching beside her. "I didn't mean to intrude." She shook her head and finally looked at me, her eyes glimmering with something fragile. "No, it's fine. I wanted someone to see this. Just someone who knows what it's like to lose something you didn't think you'd ever get back. I glanced at the letters. They were faded, envelopes yellowed with age. I recognized her handwriting on some of them, careful, precise, almost painfully neat. One letter, in particular, caught my eye. The date was 10 years ago. Her handwriting wavered slightly, and I could see the emotion that had gone into every word, even from so long ago. She left, she whispered. The man I thought I'd spend my life with. And I didn't even fight. I let him go because I didn't think I was enough. And maybe I wasn't. Her hands shook as she clutched one of the letters. I didn't know what to say, so I stayed quiet, letting her fill the space. I wanted to reach out, to touch her shoulder, but I didn't. I was afraid my presence might shatter her like thin glass. After a moment, I spoke carefully, softly. You were enough. You are enough. She looked at me then, really looked, and there was a flicker of something in her gaze, surprise, maybe hope, maybe doubt. How do you know? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Because I see it, I said. Even now. Even here. She swallowed, glancing down at the letters again, and I could see the pull of old pain mingling with something else, something unspoken, electric. She closed her eyes for a second, exhaling slowly, then opened them, meeting my gaze with a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. I haven't let anyone see this, she admitted. Not really. Not in years. Her honesty struck me more than I could explain. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't shouted or confessional, it was just her, small and human, laying a piece of herself bare in the quiet light of the store. I wanted to say something, anything, but the right words were nowhere to be found. So I stayed beside her, letting silence do the work, letting my presence be enough. Then, almost like a whisper meant only for me, she said, I don't know if I can trust myself not to fall again. And in that fragile, trembling line, I felt the weight of everything between us shift, the subtle pull of what was unspoken, the history she carried, and the undeniable gravity of her honesty. For the first time, I realized the story between us was no longer just a spark. It had become something heavier, charged, and impossible to ignore. The rain had stopped by the time I arrived at the bookstore that evening, but the air was still damp, carrying the faint scent of wet pavement and something else I couldn't name. She was behind the counter, her sleeves rolled up, cataloging new arrivals, but she didn't look up immediately when I entered. I leaned against the doorway, hands in my pockets, and waited. She finally glanced at me, her expression soft but guarded, and I felt that familiar pull, the quiet gravity that had grown between us over weeks of unspoken words and brushed knees. You stayed, she said, almost more statement than question. I didn't want to leave, I admitted. My voice was low, careful. She nodded slowly, as if acknowledging the truth that had hovered between us for too long. Neither did I, she murmured. Her hands rested on the counter, fingers brushing the edge. I noticed how tired she looked, but there was also a subtle steadiness in her posture, a quiet courage I hadn't seen before. We moved around the store together in our usual rhythm, shelving books, straightening displays, exchanging fleeting glances. Nothing was spoken, yet every glance, every half-step closer, carried the weight of all the moments that had passed, the almost confessions, the brushed hands, the late-night silences. At one point, she paused, reaching for a stack of books just as I reached for the same one. Our hands met, fingers lightly touching. The contact was fleeting, gentle, and yet it felt monumental. Neither of us pulled away immediately. I guess, we're here, I said finally, voice almost breaking the quiet spell. She exhaled softly, a small, wry smile tugging at her lips. We are, she agreed. There was no drama, no grand declaration, just recognition. The kind that feels heavier than words, and somehow more permanent. We stood there a moment longer, hands still barely touching, eyes locked. The world outside the bookstore, the flickering lights, even the faint hum of the city beyond the windows, all of it faded into the background. All that mattered was the quiet understanding that had grown between us, slow and earned, and that wouldn't be undone by anything trivial. Finally, she leaned back slightly, allowing our hands to separate, but the warmth lingered in the space between us. I leaned against the counter nearby, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. She glanced at me once more, a subtle acknowledgement passing between us. No words were needed. We didn't have to rush. The tension that had carried us here was still alive, but it had transformed into something quieter, steadier, inevitable. I watched her move, cataloging books, her hair falling naturally across her shoulders, and I realized that whatever this was, whatever we had started, it didn't need a name right now. It didn't need confessions or promises. It only needed presence. And so we stayed, side by side in that small bookstore, sharing the same space, breathing the same air, letting the unspoken speak for itself. No grand gestures, no dramatic conclusions, just us, quiet and steady, and the soft, undeniable pull of what had grown between us. I still think about that bookstore sometimes, even now, long after the rain and the late nights and the quiet tension have settled into memory. It wasn't the kind of place you leave unchanged. And neither of us walked away the same. I've learned that love isn't always a grand confession or a perfectly timed declaration. Sometimes, it's quiet. Sometimes, it's the small things, the brush of hands, the shared smile over a pile of books, the recognition that someone else sees you for all the flawed, messy pieces you carry. She changed too. I can see it now in the way she carries herself, the gentleness behind her eyes, the patience she shows when life presses harder than it should. There's a softness that wasn't there before, a trust she's allowed herself to feel again. And I can't help but think that in some small way, we gave each other permission to be human, to stumble, to pause, to stay close without needing everything defined or labeled. It's funny, in a way, how something that started with unspoken tension and awkward pauses evolved into something steady, enduring. Something I didn't know I needed until it was right there, quietly undeniable. There were no fireworks, no dramatic confessions. Just presence. Just her. Just the way she made space for me to be myself, and the way I wanted to do the same for her. Sometimes I catch myself smiling at nothing, remembering the little moments, the almost touch when reaching for the same book, the way she tilted her head when caught off guard, the tiny tremor in her voice when she admitted her past heartbreak. Those fragments of time, seemingly insignificant then, are the ones that linger. We never rushed it. We never forced it. And maybe that's the point. Real connection doesn't need fanfare. It grows quietly, sometimes in the spaces we overlook, sometimes in the silences we share, and sometimes in the unexpected courage to simply stay near someone even when nothing is certain. I don't know what the future holds, and I don't need to right now. I just know that she changed my life in the way only someone you can't stop noticing ever could. And maybe, in some small, human way, I changed hers too. So, I hold on to those memories, and I let the quiet moments between us speak louder than any grand gesture ever could. And every time I think of her, I feel it, the soft, steady pull of something that was worth waiting for, worth feeling, worth keeping. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?